She thought it was just another night with someone she loved. A simple message, a familiar face, a door she trusted would keep her safe. But what happens when trust is used as bait, and love becomes the trap? This is a fictional crime story about betrayal, silence, and the devastating cost of believing the wrong person. April 2019 began like any other quiet stretch of days, the kind that passed without demanding attention. Night settled softly over the city, and inside her small apartment, the world felt reduced to dim light and familiar silence. She sat alone, phone resting in her palm, scrolling without urgency, unaware that the moment was already narrowing towards something irreversible. The documentary voice would later describe this night as unremarkable. No storms, no raised voices, no sense of danger pressing at the edges. That was the point. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It waits for calm, for routine, for trust to lower its guard. When the message arrived, it did not feel like a warning. It felt like reassurance. A few lines, casual and warm, written by someone who had learned exactly how to sound safe. He asked if she could meet him later, suggested a hotel near the highway, framed it as privacy, as escape, as something meant just for them. There were no demands, only familiarity. She hesitated, but not because she sensed harm. Her pause came from ordinary concerns. Time, distance, the quiet question of whether she should go out so late. He responded quickly, gently, dissolving each doubt before it could settle. His words carried the weight of shared memories, late-night calls, promises whispered when the future still felt open. Trust filled the space where caution should have been. In a true crime documentary, this is where analysts would slow the footage, underline the message, replay it again and again. Not to accuse her, but to show how easily intent can hide inside affection. Nothing in the text hinted at violence or cruelty. Everything pointed toward closeness. She agreed. The camera, if there were one, would linger on her expression as she typed the final reply. There was relief there, even a hint of anticipation. She believed she was choosing connection, not risk. Outside, traffic moved steadily, indifferent to the decision being made in one quiet room. What she could not see were the omissions in his words. The things he did not say, the people he did not mention. Silence in this story was already doing its work. Later accounts would note that only two forces existed in that moment. One was trust, fragile, sincere, and freely given. The other was the person asking for it, shaping the situation with careful restraint. No witnesses, no alarms, just a message sent, received, and accepted. As she set the phone down and began preparing to leave, the night remained calm. Nothing broke. Nothing warned her. The invitation had done its job, and the path forward seemed clear. From the outside, nothing about the decision looked reckless. Friends would have recognized it as ordinary, even romantic. That normalcy is what makes stories like this difficult to hear. Harm often enters lives quietly, through doors opened willingly. This case does not begin with a crime, but with faith. And faith, once broken, reshapes everything that follows, including memory, identity, and the meaning of survival. It also exposes how easily intention can be mistaken for care when emotions blur judgment and trust feels earned. In the days that followed the message, the story pulls backward, examining the relationship that made such trust possible. Documentaries often reconstruct the past not to blame, but to understand how danger learns to blend in. What appears obvious in hindsight was once scattered across ordinary moments, easy to excuse and even easier to miss. They had met under unremarkable circumstances, and that was part of the appeal. Nothing felt rushed at first. He listened closely, remembered details, and spoke with the confidence of someone who wanted to be needed. She felt seen, and in that feeling, the foundation of trust was quietly laid. When disagreements surfaced, he framed them as concern. When questions arose, he called them misunderstandings. Each explanation arrived smoothly, practiced but gentle. Friends noticed small shifts before she did. Invitations were questioned. Time apart was met with disappointment that sounded like affection. He preferred to know where she was, who she was with, how long she would be gone. None of it felt threatening, felt like attention. In relationships, the line between care and control is thin, and it often blurs without resistance. The documentary voice slows here, replaying conversations that once felt intimate. Compliments were paired with subtle criticism. Apologies came wrapped around expectations. If she pulled away, even slightly, he reminded her of how much he had done, how deeply he felt, how rare their connection was. Love, in this version, required reassurance on his terms. There were moments when she felt uneasy, but they passed quickly. He had explanations for everything. A raised tone became stress. A jealous remark became fear of loss. The imbalance was emotional rather than physical, harder to name and easier to forgive. She learned to adjust herself to soften reactions, to avoid conflict. Without realizing it, she was negotiating for peace. What makes these patterns dangerous is their subtlety. There were no threats, no ultimatums, no obvious cruelty. Instead, there was persistence. A quiet shaping of boundaries until they no longer felt like boundaries at all. Over time, her world narrowed slightly, then a little more. Not enough to notice, but enough to matter. From the outside, the relationship still appeared functional. Laughter existed. Affection was real. That truth complicates the narrative, because manipulation does not erase genuine moments. It coexists with them. The problem was never the presence of love, but the conditions attached to it. As months passed, decisions slowly shifted toward his comfort. She checked in more often. She explained herself more carefully. When doubts surfaced, she questioned her own judgment first. Trust had not been demanded. It had been cultivated. That distinction is important, because cultivated trust feels earned, not taken. By the time the hotel suggestion arrived, it did not feel out of character. Privacy had always been framed as intimacy. Secrecy had been normalized as protection. The ground beneath the relationship had been uneven for some time, but she had learned to stand carefully, believing balance was something she simply needed to maintain. The story moves forward into motion, into preparation, into the quiet momentum that follows a decision already made. The imbalance described before now takes shape as action. The hotel, presented as a simple meeting place, becomes the focal point of the narrative. Not because it was unusual, but because it was framed as inevitable. In his message, the suggestion sounded casual. He spoke as if the location had chosen itself, as if convenience alone had guided the plan. Place halfway. A place with privacy. A place where no one would interrupt them. The documentary voice pauses here, asking a question without accusation. Whose comfort did this choice truly serve? She did not suggest the hotel. She agreed to it. That distinction matters. Agreement, shaped by months of emotional conditioning, can look identical to choice. By the time she read the address, the decision felt settled, almost routine. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was temporary. He told her it was for them. The building itself was ordinary. Clean lines, neutral colors, glass doors reflecting passing headlights. Families walked through the lobby earlier that day. Travelers checked in with rolling bags and tired expressions. Nothing about the place suggested danger. That normalcy is what allowed it to function as cover. Spaces like this are designed to feel anonymous, and anonymity can hide intention. As she approached later that night, the parking lot was quiet but not empty. A few cars, a flickering light, the distant sound of traffic. The documentary camera would linger on these details, not because they are threatening, but because they are forgettable. Danger often prefers forgettable places. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cleaner and recycled warmth. Hallways stretched in identical directions, each door closed, each room a private world. The environment offered no guidance, no warning. It absorbed people without question. In this story, the setting does not act. It allows. He texted again, confirming her arrival, guiding her step by step. His tone remained calm, reassuring, familiar. Every message reinforced the pattern she already knew. He would lead, she would follow, and harmony would be preserved. If doubt surfaced, it was quickly quieted by the belief that she was overthinking. The documentary voice highlights how environments participate in events without intent. The hotel did not create the plan, but it supported it. It offered walls, distance, and the illusion of safety. It provided a neutral ground where responsibility could feel diffused, where actions could be reframed as misunderstandings later. As she moved closer to the room, her awareness sharpened. Not fear exactly, but alertness. A sense of stepping out of the public world into something narrower. The hallway seemed longer than expected. Sounds softened. Her phone vibrated again. He was waiting. What she did not know was how much had already been decided before she arrived. Plans do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they unfold quietly, relying on trust, timing, and a setting that asks no questions. The hotel was never just a location. It was a container. By the time she reached the door, the narrative had shifted from past to present. The relationship's history, the emotional imbalance, the careful framing of this meeting, all of it converged here. The environment now held the weight of what was about to happen. The threshold she crossed was ordinary in appearance. Polished wood, a standard lock, a neutral doormat. Nothing in the environment screamed alarm. Yet the moment the door closed behind her, something imperceptible changed. The room, once imagined as a neutral space, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of her presence and waiting. The documentary voice would later dwell on this shift, highlighting how danger often arrives in the subtlest adjustments of space and sound. He greeted her with a smile, calm and practiced, but it lacked the warmth she had grown used to. Words flowed easily, familiar phrases meant to reassure, but there was a slight pause before each one, a microsecond of hesitation that her mind could not fully register. A tap of a foot behind her, the faint scrape of furniture moving, a shadow crossing a wall, small details she would remember later in fragments, disjointed, almost too minor to note at the time. The lock clicked behind her again, softer this time. It wasn't alarming, only familiar, yet it registered subconsciously, a note out of tune in a melody she expected to be flawless. Every sound in the room seemed slightly off, echoes that didn't match the shape of space, distant murmurs that didn't belong. The air smelled faintly different, a mix of fresh cleaner and something metallic that made her stomach tighten. He offered her a drink, motioning to the small table by the corner, but the movement was delayed, almost mechanical. She noticed it, then dismissed it. She told herself it was fatigue, the result of a long day, nothing more. But in hindsight, the delay was deliberate, a small disruption in rhythm, a subtle way of asserting control. Conversation continued, light at first, almost routine, but his responses carried an unfamiliar cadence. Words were clipped, pauses longer, tones slightly sharper than it had ever been. There was no overt threat, no overt aggression, just the imperceptible tilt of dominance. She felt it too late, only in retrospect, a minor sense of unease that she quickly rationalized. The room seemed to shrink around her. Shadows gathered in corners where light should have lingered. A soft hum from the air conditioner grew louder in perception, each vibration echoing like a distant warning. Her hands tightened around her bag, then loosened. She tried to focus on the familiar. His smile, the casual phrases, the idea that she was safe. But something had shifted, and her senses whispered it, even if her mind refused. Her phone lay on the table, screen glowing faintly. A message from him earlier that day flickered in her memory. Warm, inviting, casual. Now it seemed layered, coated with intentions she could not yet see. Each small sound, each delayed response, each fraction of difference in his behavior compounded, and she felt the first tremor of realization that the ordinary can hide the extraordinary, that calm can conceal manipulation. The documentary voice would later point out that fear often arrives in fragments. There was no scream, no sudden violence, only the subtle accumulation of discrepancies, the quiet hum of an environment that had shifted from neutral to charged. The danger wasn't visible, it was sensed, understood too late. The room, which had once seemed neutral, now pressed against her from every angle. Light from the small lamp cast long shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to move with intention. The quiet anomalies she had noticed earlier coalesced into something heavier, something deliberate. The subtle tension that had been building since the door closed behind her now ripened into a clear, almost tangible sense of danger. He stood near the table, leaning slightly, as if waiting for her reaction. His tone remained casual, but it carried an undercurrent she could no longer ignore. "I'm glad you came," he said, each word carefully measured. There was no overt threat, no shouting, only the soft, almost imperceptible power in the way he framed the sentence. It was not what was said, but what was left unsaid, the gaps that hung between his words. She felt her heartbeat accelerate, a pulse of cold realization coursing through her chest. Something in the rhythm of his movements, in the calculated delays between gestures, revealed that this encounter was no longer a meeting, it was a setup. The familiarity that had once offered comfort now felt like a cage, each smile, each question, each casual phrase a thread in a trap that had been spun carefully over time. "I thought you'd like it here," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the room. But the gesture was hollow. There was no warmth, only the suggestion of control. He did not ask, he informed. The room was no longer hers, the evening no longer ordinary. She could feel the manipulation in the air, in the pauses, in the way her choices seemed preempted before she could make them. Her mind raced, attempting to reconcile the affection she had known with the reality now unfolding. The emotional duality was paralyzing. Trust, once freely given, was now a weapon turned against her. The documentary voice would later note that humiliation often arrives in subtle forms. A smirk here, a shift of tone there, the implication that she had entered into a world not of her own design. "Do you feel comfortable?" he asked, but the words were empty. The question did not invite truth. It imposed it. Her unease, growing by the second, was not just emotional, it was cognitive, a dissonance between expectation and reality. The room seemed to breathe with its own agenda, every corner conspiring to isolate and disorient her. The psychological tension intensified. He spoke of trivial matters, plans, memories, shared jokes, but each reference was twisted, loaded with subtle reminders of obligation, of indebtedness, of power. Her laughter faltered. Her voice caught. The manipulation was layered, almost invisible to anyone observing from the outside, but glaringly apparent in the intimate space between them. She realized, with an almost physical shock, that she was alone in a controlled environment. Every door, every lock, every shadow had contributed to this moment. The trap, once abstract, was now undeniable. Fear seeped into her muscles, tightening her chest, drawing her gaze inward while his presence loomed outward. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click, yet the sound felt heavier than before, almost like a punctuation mark in a sentence she could not yet read. The room was still, but the stillness carried weight. In that silence, she became aware of her own breath, shallow and uneven, echoing inside her chest like a small drum. The events of the previous moments pressed against her mind, but comprehension lagged behind sensation. Time itself seemed to distort. A second stretched, then a minute, then an hour that did not exist. Her hands rested on the edge of the chair, gripping until her knuckles whitened. Thoughts collided with each other, fragments of conversation, gestures, and the faintest cues that had once seemed insignificant now gathered together to reveal a picture she could not yet fully face. The betrayal was undeniable, yet the mind struggled to name it. She attempted to speak, to articulate her unease, but words dissolved before leaving her lips. Silence became her only response, a fragile shield against a reality too sharp to confront. The documentary voice would note that trauma often manifests first as a suspension, a psychological freeze in which the body moves but the mind cannot follow. Decision, logic, and memory fragment in ways that leave the survivor feeling simultaneously present and absent. Each sound in the room became magnified. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant echo of traffic, the soft vibration of her phone. They were ordinary noises, but now they felt intrusive, invasive, as though the room itself had aligned against her. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, a rhythmic reminder of vulnerability. Images flashed unbidden in her mind. The casual smile that had concealed intent, the hollow gestures, the subtle manipulations that had seemed harmless until now. Shock suspended her moral compass, her sense of trust, even her memory of what she had believed possible. Everything familiar had been compromised in an instant, leaving her adrift in a space defined by uncertainty. She pressed her palms to her face, seeking to shield herself from recognition, from reality. The emotions were unformed yet overwhelming, a blend of fear, disbelief, and the faint, sharp sting of humiliation. Her body trembled, though she was still. Her voice, when it emerged, was barely audible, a whisper to herself that went unanswered. The documentary tone would later describe this stage as the collapse of internal frameworks. When trust is broken in an environment designed to isolate, comprehension does not come in sequence. It arrives in fragments. First as shock, then as confusion, then as the dawning recognition that what was believed to be safe has been weaponized. Each fragment carries weight, and the mind struggles to assemble them into coherent thought. For her, silence became both sanctuary and prison. She sat, unmoving, aware of the space around her, but unable to engage with it meaningfully. Every instinct urged escape, yet the paralysis of shock restrained her. Her trust, once freely given, had transformed into absence, an empty vessel that could no longer guide her decisions. By the time she finally lifted her gaze, the room seemed different. Shadows had shifted, angles had changed, and yet the threat was both tangible and invisible. The narrative of the trap remained unbroken, but she was beginning to perceive its contours. The next chapter would follow the emergence of that awareness. As she struggled to reconcile fear with understanding, confusion with action, and silence with the first stirrings of self-preservation. The aftermath of the silence left her mind restless, caught between fragments of memory and the pressure of immediate emotion. In the stillness of the room, she replayed every interaction, every pause, every smile that had once seemed comforting. Each recalled gesture now felt loaded, a potential signal she had misread, a warning she had ignored. The documentary voice would later describe this as the cognitive stage of trauma, the mind attempting to assemble a shattered narrative from pieces that refused to fit. Guilt crept first, subtle and insidious. She questioned her own judgment, asking why she had not sensed the danger sooner, why she had placed trust where it could be weaponized. Each thought fed the next, spiraling through corridors of what-ifs and should-haves. The emotional weight of self-blame pressed against her chest, a heaviness that made simple movement feel deliberate and calculated. Disbelief followed, like a cold wind brushing across the spine. The brain, unwilling to fully accept the breach of trust, flinched at the reality before her. Was this really happening? Could someone she had known, loved, and relied on truly be capable of such manipulation? The answer seemed both obvious and impossible, a contradiction she could not reconcile. Memory became both tormentor and guide. She replayed moments she had once cherished. The late-night conversations, the laughter over trivial jokes, the touch of a hand that had felt tender. Now, each memory was dual in nature, containing both affection and duplicity, comfort and betrayal. The psychological tension was overwhelming. Recollection itself became suspect, an unreliable narrator of her own life. Anger surfaced, sharp and sudden, but it was uneven, difficult to direct. Part of her wished to confront, to demand accountability, yet another part recoiled, weighed down by fear and the residual shock that still vibrated through her body. Emotional equilibrium had been replaced by a battlefield, each feeling conflicting with the next, leaving her mind in constant negotiation with itself. The documentary lens would later emphasize how trauma distorts perception. The room around her, once merely a hotel space, now seemed alive with implication. Shadows carried threat, every object a potential reminder of manipulation. Normal sounds, the hum of the air conditioner, distant traffic, took on exaggerated significance. Reality itself felt rewritten, colored by the emotional residue of betrayal and the anticipation of potential danger. She wrestled with the need for justice, though clarity was elusive. Her moral compass pushed toward confrontation, truth-telling, and accountability, but the path was obscured by fear, shame, and uncertainty. The desire to act clashed with the immobilizing effects of shock, leaving her in a liminal state, neither entirely passive nor fully in control. Internal dialogue churned endlessly. I should have known. I should have left. I should have resisted. And yet another voice whispered, "It's not your fault. You trusted. That trust was never yours to predict or control." The tension between these competing narratives consumed her attention, dictating the slow rhythm of breath and heartbeat. As she gradually lifted her gaze from the floor, the room no longer felt entirely oppressive. Awareness was returning in fragments, a cautious recognition that while her emotional state was fractured, the mind was beginning to negotiate with fear. The story of what had occurred was still raw, but the edges of understanding were forming. The quiet of the room persisted, but now it carried a new weight. Silence no longer felt like an oppressive force. It had become a space for reflection, for reckoning with choices that had not yet been made. In the aftermath of betrayal, she understood that fear could only hold her for so long. Yet truth, she realized, demanded something far more taxing: endurance. Her mind circled the question endlessly. Should I speak? Should I act? Each scenario carried consequences she could not fully predict. The man who had orchestrated the evening wielded power that was subtle yet absolute, a mastery of timing, persuasion, and expectation. Speaking out meant confronting that power, exposing both him and herself to scrutiny, judgment, and retaliation. The psychological cost was high, and she felt it pressing against her from every angle. The documentary voice would later highlight this stage as a turning point. The moment when fear is no longer the dominant force, but neither is courage effortless. Courage in this context was not a dramatic declaration or a sudden outburst. It was slow, deliberate, exhausting. It was the decision to persist in acknowledging the truth, even when doing so brought discomfort, risk, and personal vulnerability. She rehearsed conversations silently, testing phrases against imagined responses. Each trial brought a mix of relief and dread. What if no one believed her? What if the betrayal was minimized, dismissed as misunderstanding or exaggeration? Each potential dismissal carried its own weight, but remaining silent, remaining within the protective shell of avoidance, felt like surrender. Memory and fear clashed again. The gestures, the words, the careful manipulations replayed in her mind, now reframed through a lens sharpened by clarity. She could no longer deny what had occurred. The emotional manipulation, the subtle control, the orchestration of isolation. It all coalesced into a single, undeniable narrative. The truth was hers to hold, and its weight was immense. Speaking out was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming space, dignity, and agency in a situation designed to strip all three away. Each imagined conversation emphasized the stakes. Friends, family, even strangers, how would they respond? Could they grasp the complexity, the subtlety, the psychological cruelty? She understood that the act of truth-telling would not immediately restore balance, nor would it undo the damage. But it was a necessary step, a pivot from passivity to self-preservation. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her phone, hovering over the screen. Not yet dialing, not yet typing, but preparing. The act itself felt monumental. Fear had not disappeared. It lingered, a coiled presence. Yet beneath it, endurance was forming, a resolve that the narrative would no longer be dictated solely by the betrayer. The truth, heavy and unwieldy, had a power of its own. The documentary perspective would emphasize the emotional cost. Speaking out exposes vulnerability. It challenges authority, disrupts the illusion of control, and invites judgment. Yet remaining silent carries an invisible penalty. The slow erosion of self, the quiet acceptance of manipulation, the surrender of agency. Choosing endurance over fear becomes an act of reclamation, even when it exacts a toll on the psyche. The decision to speak had been made, but the act itself rippled outward, touching every part of her world in ways she could neither predict nor fully control. Consequences, she discovered, were rarely linear. They arrived in waves, in small, almost imperceptible ways before crescendoing into moments of undeniable impact. The documentary lens would linger on these effects, showing that accountability, while necessary, rarely unfolds in tidy resolutions. The social repercussions were immediate yet uneven. Friends and acquaintances responded with a mixture of disbelief, support, and hesitation. Some questioned her perception, asking for details she was still processing, unintentionally placing the burden of proof on her shoulders. Others offered quiet reassurance, a presence that felt heavy with empathy but light on solutions. Each reaction was a reminder that the world beyond the room was complex, unpredictable, and sometimes unkind. Emotionally, the toll was relentless. Speaking out did not erase fear, nor did it reverse the psychological fractures left by betrayal. Guilt, frustration, and lingering doubt persisted, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life. She questioned decisions long after the fact, replaying moments in her mind and assessing whether the narrative she now controlled was fully coherent, fully understandable even to herself. Trauma had not left her. It had reshaped her awareness, forcing every interaction and choice to carry the shadow of prior manipulation. The room she had once entered without concern now became a symbolic echo of consequences she could not avoid. Every memory of the trap, every detail of the orchestrated betrayal, lingered as both lesson and warning. There was no satisfaction in revelation, no sense of closure in exposure. The manipulator remained, in some ways, unpunished by formal systems, yet the psychological weight of accountability had shifted. Consequences existed, but they were uneven, complex, and sometimes incomplete. The documentary tone emphasizes that justice is imperfect. Laws, procedures, and societal structures may intervene, but they cannot fully repair what has been broken, nor can they fully prevent future harm. Here, responsibility is personal, moral, and enduring. The story frames accountability not as a neat outcome, but as a lived, continuous process that requires vigilance, reflection, and the courage to confront both fear and ambiguity. In practical terms, daily life began to reflect the subtle shifts that consequence brings. She noticed herself pausing before speaking, scanning her surroundings, assessing the intent behind words and gestures. She found that her perception of safety had changed irrevocably, yet the endurance she had cultivated allowed her to navigate the world with measured caution rather than complete withdrawal. Her trust, though fractured, was now informed by experience and awareness rather than naivety. The narrative also examines the cost to the manipulator. While outward appearances remained unchallenged, the exposure of intent created invisible fractures, suspicion, social distance, and subtle loss of control. Power is rarely absolute. Even the most carefully orchestrated schemes are subject to unforeseen consequences. Yet the story does not dwell on retribution. Instead, it presents consequence as natural, inevitable, and morally instructive, even when incomplete. After the weight of consequences settled into her awareness, a different clarity emerged, one that reframed the entire story. The documentary lens would later focus on this stage as the moment power itself is redefined. What had seemed to belong entirely to the betrayer, the control, the manipulation, the quiet dominance, was, in truth, an illusion sustained by her compliance, his careful orchestration, and the subtle social context that allowed the trap to function. In retrospect, she could see how every decision had been framed, every step subtly guided. Yet, paradoxically, the act of perception, the recognition that she had been deceived, began to shift the balance. Knowledge, even when painful, carried weight. By naming the manipulation, by acknowledging the betrayal, she reclaimed a measure of agency. Power was no longer absolute. It had never been absolute. The documentary voice would point out that suffering has a peculiar way of exposing unseen forces. Every fear, every hesitation, every pause she had experienced was now illuminated as part of a larger pattern. Control had appeared to reside in his gestures, his words, and the physical space of the room. But real control lay in her response, her endurance, and the eventual decision to confront the truth. She had survived the designed manipulation, and in surviving, She became a participant in shaping outcomes rather than merely enduring them. The room, once a theater of subtle intimidation, now appeared differently in memory. Shadows lost their oppressive weight, silence lost its coercive power, and every pause he had used to assert authority now read as part of an elaborate performance, one whose structure she had finally understood. The narrative shifted. The story was not about chance or opportunity. It was about intention, and understanding intention clarified where power truly resided. Even his composure, once a source of fear, now seemed fragile under scrutiny. The small discrepancies, the calculated hesitations, the micro-expressions of control, they were deliberate, yes, but they had relied on her unawareness. Power, it seemed, was co-constructed. Without trust, without the willingness to believe in safety, his orchestration would have been impotent. This insight did not erase pain, nor did it undo the manipulation or the betrayal. What it did do was provide a framework for reflection. Control, when re-examined, is always relational. Every act of dominance depends upon the perception of the dominated. And every act of endurance, acknowledgement, and eventual assertion of self alters that balance, even in small ways. The documentary would linger here, emphasizing the moral subtlety. Power is not only about who acts, but about who perceives, who responds, and who carries the consequences. By surviving, by understanding, by recognizing manipulation for what it was, she reclaimed authority over her own narrative. She began to see the story not as one of helplessness, but as one in which intention and response intertwined, shaping both experience and outcome. The room that once contained manipulation and subtle terror now exists only in memory, refracted through experience and introspection. The documentary voice emphasizes that the true weight of the story lies not in spectacle, but in understanding, the slow accumulation of lessons that emerge when trust is broken. Her voice, though personal, transforms into something symbolic. It represents countless others who have walked through similar corridors of faith, only to find betrayal waiting at the threshold. The narrative extends beyond one incident, illustrating how ordinary decisions, accepting invitations, believing in someone's words, placing safety in the hands of another, can have irreversible consequences when boundaries are manipulated and intentions hidden. She becomes a vessel for caution, a mirror reflecting the fragility of trust and the vigilance required to protect it. The documentary lens highlights the subtle moral calculus of everyday relationships. Blind trust, once freely given, can be exploited by those who understand its value. Affection and attention, when combined with manipulation, become tools of control. Yet the story does not dwell on the perpetrator's cleverness. Instead, it focuses on the cost borne by the one who trusted, the emotional labor of surviving deception, and the slow, difficult process of reclaiming agency. Isolation, self-doubt, and the lingering fear of misjudgment remain as psychological echoes. The survivor's mind cycles through questions of responsibility, not in blame toward herself, but in an effort to understand and to prevent future harm. How did this happen? What signs were missed? How might awareness have altered outcomes? These questions are uncomfortable, unresolvable, yet necessary. They form the foundation of vigilance, the knowledge that trust, though essential to human connection, carries inherent risk when placed without discernment. The narrative emphasizes moral accountability as an internal process. External consequences may be incomplete. Societal structures rarely provide perfect justice. Yet the internal reckoning, the understanding of ethical boundaries, the recognition of manipulation, the determination to act decisively in moments of uncertainty, is invaluable. Responsibility is not simply the avoidance of harm, but the cultivation of awareness, judgment, and courage. Vigilance, awareness, and moral responsibility are lifelong practices. Trust is powerful, but power unchecked is dangerous. And the cost of ignoring these truths, of placing faith blindly in another, can shape lives in ways that are irreversible, sobering, and profoundly instructive. The story closes, leaving lessons that extend far beyond the walls of a single hotel room, resonating wherever human connection and the risk of betrayal exists.